Rush, by the mid-2020s, stood at a crossroads. With the tragic passing of Neil Peart in 2020, the band's future had seemed sealed. The percussion seat was not just any role. Peart was songwriter, lyricist, and a virtuoso whose identity was deeply entwined with the band's sound. Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson wrestled with grief, loss, and loyalty, not simply to a band, but to a brother in music. Could they honor that legacy without betraying it? The years following Peart's death were quiet. Lee and Lifeson spent time apart, reflecting on what Rush had meant to them and to fans. Yet whispers arose, might the time ever come for them to step back on stage? In interviews, Lee admitted that the idea felt impossible for a long time. How do you replace someone who is, in his view, irreplaceable? The emotional weight of that question lingered. But gradually, in casual jam sessions, in quiet conversations, and in mutual longing for the creative tension they once shared, the possibility began to flicker. For Lee, the question became, if we do return, how do we do so with integrity, with respect, and with someone who can truly add to the story rather than merely fill a hole? Behind every artist's rise lies a network of unseen connections. For Rush, the link came through a surprising source, their longtime bass technician, Scully. During one of his stints working with Jeff Beck, Scully had toured with a drummer named Annika Nils, and he frequently came home raving about her. Her name began to surface in Lee's thoughts. Lee first mentioned hearing about her in a 2023 Guardian interview. "I heard this drummer the other day, I think her name is Annika. She played on the last Jeff Beck tour and I thought she was terrific." That remark, initially casual, was a seed. Lee and Lifeson knew they would be searching for someone with deep musical sensitivity, and if someone in their inner circle was already singing praises, it was worth looking deeper. Lee's curiosity led to online research, watching her performances on YouTube, and reaching out to see whether a collaboration might be possible. The more he learned about her technique, her musical breadth, her reputation among peers, the more the spark grew from chance mention to serious possibility. Thus, a path opened, not through mass auditions or public casting calls, but through trust, recommendation, and organic musical admiration. Even after discovering her name, Lee and Lifeson approached cautiously. The history of Rush was not one to gamble recklessly, and the decision to resume touring was itself uncertain. They did not want auditions in the public eye or pressures from a fan base expecting perfection. Instead, they framed the process as exploratory, almost private. Lee has said that they very secretly brought Annika to Canada as an experiment, not as an audition, because at that point they weren't entirely sure they would tour. The sessions were not about filtering her against Neil Peart's ghost, but about seeing musical chemistry, feel, and mutual respect. Lee and Lifeson played older Rush material with her, gauged how she handled the nuances, watched how she responded to improvisation, and listened to whether she could internalize the emotional, rhythmic soul of their catalog. They also assessed whether she could bring her own identity while honoring the foundational pulse of Rush's sound. In those sessions, trust grew, bridges of communication opened, and doubts were confronted head-on. Could she handle the weight of legacy? Did she respect what came before? Could she be a collaborator and not a replacement? Beyond technique, the real question was about feel and emotional alignment. In interviews, Lee emphasized that bringing in a new drummer wasn't simply about replicating fills and patterns, but about interpreting them with the emotion and momentum that underpinned Rush's music. He acknowledged that many drummers can play Peart's fills, but the more difficult task is combining them with the feel of the songs so they feel the way you guys want to hear those songs. In those sessions with Annika, she had to absorb not just the notes, but the phrasing, the subtle shifts in tempo, the atmospheric textures, and the breathing space between hits. There were moments of translation. Lee and Lifeson would explain why certain dynamics, accents, or place in a measure mattered. She would listen, retry, rework. It became an iterative dialogue, not a one-sided test, but a three-way musical conversation among the legacy of Rush, the present chemistry of collaboration, and the potential of a new voice. Over time, as Lee and Lifeson watched her assimilate, respond, and gradually inhabit the music, they grew more confident that this was not a stopgap but a surprising, hopeful continuation. Still, the decision to commit was daunting. Rush's reputation, their fans' expectations, and the memory of Neil Peart all loomed large. In public statements, Lee acknowledged that replacing someone irreplaceable was no small task. They needed someone who could carry forward the technical demands of their catalog, which is famously complex, while also absorbing emotional zero-gravity, the weight of history, and the demand of live performance. But they also needed to feel joy again. As Lifeson has said, when the two began jamming Rush songs again after years apart, the difficulty reminded them just how profound their earlier work had been. For Lee and Lifeson, the risk was not only whether the new drummer would measure up. It was whether they themselves could rediscover the joy, the spark, and the hunger to step back on stage. At some point, wordless signals, musical smiles in rehearsal, and fleeting moments of transcendence made it clear. They didn't just want someone who could keep the seat warm, they needed someone who could energize them to live in the music again. With those internal affirmations in place, Lee and Lifeson resolved to go public. The new era would begin with an announcement. Rush was reuniting, and they had chosen Annika Nills as drummer for their upcoming 50-something tour. At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Lee and Lifeson revealed their decision, acknowledging the difficulty and emotional weight of continuing without Peart. Lee spoke frankly about how Scully's recommendation seeded the idea, how he had looked her up, and how sessions ultimately convinced them she could be more than just a technical fill-in. Lifeson acknowledged that being back in the rehearsal space with Lee rekindled a spark he hadn't felt in years. The announcement was both celebratory and reverent. They were not trying to resurrect the past, but to honor it and to step into a future that remained rooted in Rush's identity. Fans and media responded with cautious optimism, curiosity, and high expectations. From that moment, the relationship between band and public entered a new phase. Years of private decision-making became a shared journey. Once the decision was public, the pressure intensified. Every interview, headline, and fan reaction would test the legitimacy of their choice. Lee and Lifeson understood that Annika would be scrutinized by critics, by fans deeply loyal to Peart, and by the press hungry for controversy. Lee has described what it's like to play with the new drummer, revealing that she had to really try to get into Neil's headspace to replicate not just patterns but feeling. The band also emphasized that the selection process was never about auditioning publicly, but about internal compatibility and musical chemistry. Meanwhile, the band planned to expand their live lineup by bringing in another musician or two to free up Alex and Lee and enable them to go deeper into their arrangements. As rehearsals ramped up, the trio confronted the challenge of translating studio perfection into live energy. Every drum fill, tempo shift, transition, and dynamic moment needed to align with what fans remembered, but also breathe new life. The spotlight, ordinarily external, now shone inward on the trio's chemistry, trust, and adaptability under pressure. A central tension in this reunion is balancing reverence for past work with allowing new interpretations to emerge. Lee and Lifeson have been clear. They're not trying to recreate Rush exactly as it was, but to celebrate its core while moving forward. That means embracing subtle changes, allowing Annika to bring her voice, and occasionally reworking arrangements for live performance. But that also means meticulous care, no liberties that would betray the identity of the songs. In interviews, Lee has said that the translation process required explaining subtleties, dynamics, and context to Annika. They practiced with modest lineups, trimmed parts, and in some moments leaned into simpler renditions to preserve clarity. The live setlist planning also reflects this balance. They plan a vast selection from across their catalog, not just the hits, trusting that fans will embrace deeper cuts alongside familiar favorites. Over time, the trio built a shared musical language, sometimes making small shifts, reinterpreting transitions, or adjusting dynamics, always anchored in mutual respect and a shared vision. As the tour dates began to roll out, excitement built across fan communities. Rush announced that their 50-something tour would run through North America in summer 2026, starting in Los Angeles and ending in Cleveland, with stops in Mexico City, Fort Worth, Chicago, New York, Toronto, among others. Ticket sales, media coverage, fan speculation, and preview clips from rehearsal all fed into a growing momentum. The band made clear that Peart's family supported the tour and that this was meant as a tribute, not as a replacement. Lee and Lifeson spoke openly about how they had done soul-searching before committing to return. Meanwhile, Annika's profile rose, fans dug into her past performances, critics debated the legitimacy of her selection, and social media lit up with comparisons, excitement, and caution. The band's management, production, and crew worked behind the scenes to ensure sound, staging, lighting, and logistics lived up to the legacy. As rehearsal videos and photos leaked, fans speculated on set lists, surprises, and how the band would present themselves. The stage was being built not just physically, but emotionally, a space for expectations, hopes, memory, and renewal to converge. In the months leading up to the tour, everything converged: rehearsal, logistics, emotional readiness, and fan anticipation. Lee, Lifeson, and Annika continued refining timing, transitions, and interplay, ensuring that every drum fill, bass line, and guitar riff felt alive. They adjusted stage arrangements, worked with additional supporting musicians, and rehearsed full set lists, sometimes 35 songs, that would allow fluidity and variation from night to night. For Lee and Lifeson, stepping back into that world carried both exhilaration and humility. They were acutely aware that the audience would hear everything: the strengths, the flaws, the moments where Annika would shine or stumble. But they were also committed to doing this on their terms, trusting in the chemistry they had built and in the spirit of resurrection rather than replication. When the tour begins in June 2026, they will open not just a set of old songs but a living narrative, honoring Neil Peart, celebrating decades of Rush, and welcoming a new chapter. For fans, it will be a moment of reckoning and wonder. Do these songs still breathe? Can they still cut? And can a band that lost one of its central hearts truly live again? The answer, from what Lee has shared, seems poised on a hopeful yes, not erasing the past, but carrying it forward.